Hola, mi nombre es Dagati, and that is all the Spanish I know, so the rest of this, unfortunately, will have to be in English. I'm coming to you from New Jersey, and I'm here to talk to you about the functional movement system. So I'm going to get out of the way and show you my presentation. Before we talk about what the functional movement system is, we first need to define what is functional. And if you look at the definition, it means of having a special purpose specifically related to a specific task. And so we need to look at what do we mean by functional. And so the first thing we need to understand is that we're not going to be looking at parts as we traditionally would in assigning exercises to train a specific part. And then when we look at movement, we need to understand that movement is not exercise. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Because if we think of the squat is what we see on the right and what we think about when we look at the picture on the right. But on the left, that is the same exact movement pattern, just with less load and with a very specific task that is oriented with it. The person on the left does not do 12 repetitions of going down into the dryer to get the towels. He is just there to get the towels, where the purpose on the right is a specific overload to create a specific response, whether it be strength, power, hypertrophy, or anything that you might use an exercise to try to develop. Now, if we're talking about squats, the challenge we have is, how do we know if a person should squat as an exercise? This video is of a high-level high school athlete that came into me to start a training program. That is the best squat that he can produce with no load. So what would be nice for an athlete like that is if we had a light around our door when they walked in and said it would light up green if the person was fine to move and there was no limitations, or it would light up red if there was restrictions that said this person has risk factors and we need to be careful about what we do with this individual. But we need to decide what is our criteria for movement. How do we decide what is good quality movement? That is where the functional movement screen comes in. The movement screen looks at 7 different movement patterns and has a gauge from 0 to 3 on how to measure that quality. Those 7 patterns are based on patterns that we use functionally every day, as well as patterns that we developed from when we were babies as part of our neural developmental system that we'll talk about in a little bit. The first goal of the functional movement system is to do no harm. So when that person comes through the door with a risk factor, the last thing we want to do is add additional stress into their body that is going to possibly create injury or pain. So the first reason why we do a screen is to make sure that we're not making this individual worse. The scoring system for the FMS works as follows. A 3 is perfect. Given a certain standard and a set of rules for each movement, if you achieve all those markers, you achieve a 3. If we need to modify the screen in some way, shape, or form, such as putting a board under your heels for the squat, and that's the only way you can do it perfectly, or we lessen the marker that you need to achieve, that is called a 2. If we modify the scoring criteria and you still cannot achieve the movement to a certain degree, that is where is it a 1. If you should have pain in any way, shape, or form, regardless of the quality of the movement, that is a 0. So based on that, when a person comes in the door, we need to figure out what is their biggest issue and what do we need to address. And sometimes it may be just 1, it may be 2, or all 3 of these categories here. If someone is in pain, well, that automatically directs us to what we call our SFMA. That is our clinical and medical model called the Selective Functional Movement Assessment. The reason why we're sending anybody with pain to here, because we need to know is that pain something that is derivative of a movement issue, or is this something that may be a medical problem that shows itself in movement, such as someone who has low back pain, but may be secondary to something that's happening internal, whether it be a tumor or whether it be some sort of organ dysfunction. The entry level point then is the FMS for healthy individuals. And we need to see, do you have competent mobility as well as motor control to go through those 7 basic patterns that we looked at earlier. Now, if you have good enough movement competency, meaning you're scoring at least a 2 on all the scores in the FMS, we now need to look at what is your capacity, meaning once we now start to put load on you, how are you going to be able to handle that? And that's where the FCS, or the fundamental capacity screen, comes in. When we talk about pain, we need to distinguish, is it pain or is it dysfunction? Pain, as I said, can come from multiple different sources. Dysfunction could be a behavior such as a gait pattern that is off, that has been reinforced for years and years. Dysfunction may be a limitation that is now causing a compensation to create alterations in their movement. But either way, we need to distinguish between the two, because you can have movement that is perfect movement but is yet painful. You can have movement that is dysfunctional but brings with it no pain. Dysfunction is what we're looking to correct with the movement screen and the FMS above that pain line. Once we have pain and below that line, that's where we look at the SFMA and now go into a medical model. Now, most people, when they look at the FMS, they focus on the total score. So if you were to total up all 7 tests, a perfect score would be a 21. I can tell you from personally seeing tens of thousands of screens that I've only seen less than 12 perfect movement scores. The goal is not a perfect score. What we're looking at is how do we get to that score, and what are the individual scores that we need to consider. Another misconception of the FMS is that it is a predictor of performance. We're looking at movement competency with the movement screen. Until we get into the FCS and start to look at your capacity, we can't start to begin to predict your athleticism or your ability to do certain things like running and jumping and changing direction. So just because you can do something like the hurdle step that you see on the left and do that with proficiency does not necessarily mean you're going to be able to run faster. But what we can tell you is that if you can't achieve at least a 1 on the hurdle step, that it is going to be a significant roadblock and barrier to being able to achieve proper running mechanics. So the hourglass looks like this. FMS is the entry point. If we should find pain on the FMS, you immediately go down to the SFMA and start to break out what is the driver of this pain, and is it a movement impairment that we can address through either soft tissue work, joint mobilization, or motor control training, or do we need to go into a deeper medical treatment? Above that line, we're looking at movement competency with the FMS, and then once you get above that, you're now looking to look into some performance factors, looking at your impact control, power control, your postural control, as well as your motor control at a higher level in the FCS. And then once we've accomplished that, now we can look into some sport-specific skill factors as we get into whatever the activity is that we're looking to put this individual into. So the decision tree goes as follows. If you do the FMS and it's functional, you then go to the develop piece and go to the FCS. If you do the FMS and you find dysfunction, meaning you found 1s on the test score, you would then go to protect and correct, meaning if there's certain patterns that are faulty and they're 1s, there are certain exercises we're going to have you not do, and then we're going to try to correct some of the faults that we find within that pattern. If there is pain, we immediately then try to protect you from doing anything that would flare that up worse with those movement patterns that may be related to it, and we want to go dive deeper into the SFMA. The second goal is, how do I choose appropriate exercises? Meaning there is a continuum of exercises starting with the most basic ground-based exercises all the way up to high-level things like squatting and running and jumping. So we need to figure out which exercises are appropriate for the individual that's in front of me. To do this, we have to change our approach and stop looking at things in terms of parts and look at things in terms of patterns. If we look at the most blamed muscle in the body, it is the psoas and the hip flexors. Now, if you were to tell me that you failed any given test on the movement screen because of a tight hip flexor or overactive hip flexor, my question to you would then be, if you failed your deep squat because your hip flexors are tight, why did your hip flexors not become a problem when we did our hurdle step, when we did our inline lunge, when we did our active straight leg raise, when we did our trunk stability push-up and rotary stability? Because the psoas and the hip flexors are involved in all of those patterns as well. So if it is only showing you a problem in one pattern, the problem is not the part, the problem is the pattern. If you were to have issues with the psoas in all 6 of those patterns, then you may have a case for a specific part issue. We all know that the body is interrelated in that everything that starts at the foot gets connected all the way up to the top of the head, and it starts to bring about the concept of regional interdependence, where the parts above and below any certain area are dependent on the mobility and stability of those parts next to it. Now, how did we learn how to move? We learned how to move in the first 21 months of our life. Now, the World Health Organization has standards for movement for the first 21 months of our life. What we look for is that when a baby starts to develop, they first start by eye tracking, then they'll start to lift their heads and roll over, then they'll go up onto hands and knees and begin to creep and rock, then they'll start to crawl, and then they can hold themselves up in a seated position, eventually up into a kneeling position. That's their transitionary position to get them up into squatting so they can pull themselves up into standing. And then once they're up and standing, that's when we get them on the move and start to walk. The problem is, after 21 months, we no longer have standards for movement. That's where the movement screen comes into play. Now, when we look at the difference between mobility and motor control, all of those babies we just saw, they don't have issues with mobility because they haven't been sitting in desks and chairs for their entire lives, being students and being workers. But now, as we get people later in their lives, they're starting to develop significant mobility restrictions. But we can often make the misperception that these mobility problems are pure mobility issues when they may actually just be a motor control issue. Let's look at a few people squatting. If we have these 2 individuals squatting next to each other, we automatically draw our eyes to the person on the left and assume that this person is tight and that they need stretching and mobility work. But if we were to take them and lay them on the back on a table, the person that's on the right looks the same as he does when he's on his back, and the person that's on the left now all of a sudden achieves the same exact range of motion as that person on the right. So what happened? What we did is took away gravity, and now once gravity is not in play, now all of a sudden all those governors within the muscle spindles and joint receptors that put the brakes on when he was loaded now allow him to get into that free range of motion. So this person is not a mobility issue. He's actually a motor control issue in disguise. The third goal of the functional movement system is to audit your programs to make sure that what you're doing is enhancing movement and not taking away from it. So we need to decide what is good enough. What are we going to decide as a appreciable amount of movement that allows us to move forward and add stress to this individual? So we look at, if we have issues, we stop and we try to correct those issues. But when we correct them, we correct and move on. The other misconception with the FMS is that we just constantly are correcting people's movement. Yes, we do, but with a very specific purpose, and that purpose is to correct any one position or posture just enough that we can get them into the next posture, that we can get them up to standing. If you see these 3 drills, all of them involve hip flexion on one side with hip extension on the other, and you can see that this exercise progression follows the neurodevelopmental sequence of going from supine up to a transitional posture and half kneeling, and finally up to standing. Now, let's look at some other considerations. When we look at movement, it's not just about the muscles that are involved. We have to look at the joint mobility. We have to look at the elasticity of the soft tissues. We have to look at the motor control and how well you can actually control those over certain ranges of motion. The biggest thing, and the reason why it's highlighted in here, is pain. Pain will alter movement significantly. So you are not going to get a good read on someone's movement if they're in pain, and that's why we don't have you do a movement screen on someone that walks in pain. We immediately get you into the SFMA. Strength, previous injury, anatomical factors, posture, position, or other things that are movement factors that we need to consider that may be affecting what you're seeing in someone's movement. Then there's other factors that a lot of people don't consider. Things such as breathing. Breathing will have both direct and indirect effect on movement. Sleep, emotions, climate, gut health and digestion, hydration, hormones, movement habits, the cognition, meaning how well does someone understand what you're asking them to do, and mirroring. If you demonstrated a movement for someone, or they're going to do it similar to how you do it. So if you don't do it properly, they're not going to do it properly. The key with being successful with the movement system is to have a network, meaning as someone who's a strength coach and not a medical professional, I need to have a strong network of people that are clinicians and medical professionals that I can refer to when I do have that individual that's in pain, that understands what our process is, so we can create a standard operating procedure and a common language that we can use back and forth when trying to get this patient out of pain and back into everyday function. That's just a quick snapshot overview of how the functional movement system works. There's a lot more that you can find out if you were to go to functionalmovement.com. You can also visit my website and ask me any questions above and beyond there, and contact me via email or social media. That's it for today. Thank you everyone for your time. Buenos dias.